Welcome in to Locked On Knicks. Alex Wolf here. And the Knicks lost to the Magic, but I'm just going to choose to ignore that today and not cover that game at all. I don't think it's a game that anybody particularly wants to hear about anyway. At this point in the season, the Knicks losing to a lottery team. Instead, as promised, I have a really great interview today with Harvey Araton, who was a former beat writer for the Knicks, a former NBA reporter who still does some work for the New York Times, and most importantly, the author of the book When the Garden Was Eden. And we talk about Willis Reed, the recently departed captain of the Knicks, the forever captain of the Knicks. And so I had a great talk with Harvey, and I'll get into it next on Locked On Knicks.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome in to Locked On Knicks, and I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Knicks your first listen today and every day, whether you're checking us out on your favorite podcast platform or taking in the sights and sounds on YouTube. I appreciate you making us a part of your daily routine. Make sure to subscribe wherever it is that you listen or watch, and also hit the notification bell or the auto download function so you never miss an episode like this great one that's coming up. I'm Alex Wolf. I'm editor-in-chief of Knicks site The Strickland, which you can find at thestrick.land. And as I said in the intro, I am joined by Harvey Araton, who is a legend as far as Knicks writers are concerned, at least as far as I'm concerned, writer of When the Garden Was Eden, and just an absolute treasure trove of facts about the championship Knicks teams, having both grown up watching those teams and then grown into a role as a beat writer and an NBA reporter after that. And then, of course, writing one of the best Knicks books ever later on. So I was super excited to have this conversation with Harvey. We did a really long uh, 4-part podcast with him back during COVID, talking about these teams at length. But I wanted to revisit and talk about Willis Reed with him as a way to remember Willis and also do him justice, because Gavin and I mentioned on the show the other day that we didn't quite feel right being able to speak on Willis Reed because he's just, neither of us were even born during his heyday. And, we weren't even really around for like the 90s Knicks, let alone the 70s Knicks. So we always like to get better perspectives from people that were there and know these people better. So I won't hold us up anymore. Let's get into the interview with Harvey about the great Willis Reed. All right, as promised, I am joined by Harvey Araton, who authored When the Garden Was Eden, which, if you haven't read it, one of the best Knicks books out there, and certainly in my opinion, the best book to read if you want to learn about the 1970 and 73 title teams. Also, just a couple years ago, authored Our Last Season about his friendship with longtime Knicks season ticket holder Michelle Musler. Also was the Knicks beat writer starting in 1978 till around 1985, then an NBA writer for various outlets, including the New York Times, where he still writes to this day. Harvey, how are you? Thank you so much for joining me, first off. And I'm very excited to talk about Willis Reed with you and hopefully do some justice to his legacy.
Well, thanks for having me. It's the second day since we got the news, and it's still, I think, particularly for those of us of a certain age, I would count the baby boom generation, New Yorkers. It's losing Willis was really like losing a big primary chunk of our youth.
Yeah, it's funny. I think Gavin and I were sort of talking about this when we were trying to honor Willis on our show and our show yesterday, and sort of were like, it's tough for us to fully appreciate how much he meant to that generation, right? Like Clyde, I think, is the unique, the most one of the most unique sports players ever, in the sense that he meant a ton to your generation and also means a ton to our generation, thanks to his work in the announcing booth and how much of a character he is. But Willis Reed is a guy that I feel like my generation never really got to know super well. You know, he would show up for team events and stuff, and obviously you can watch as many highlights as you want, but it just doesn't quite compare to being in the moment. Obviously you lived it. You know, you were part of the city at that time. You grew up a Knicks fan. You know, you got to experience those titles in person. Like, I guess the first question, I was actually going to save this for later, but I'll just lead with it. Like, how will you remember Willis Reed as someone who was there? I guess I'll start with as a player before you got to know him. Like, how do you remember the legacy that he left, like on the city and on the game of basketball and everything from those title runs?
Well, he represents an era where the game was very different. The league was very different. It was much more, localized. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was the age before, all the Nike commercials, and that was really something that was pioneered by Michael Jordan in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s. But Willis was sort of like, we like to remember our athletes as these strong, dignified, team-oriented, people, and he personified that, as much as anyone, I think, whoever played any major sport in New York City. And, somebody asked me the other day, that why is Willis considered, when we talk about all the captains that we've had, Mark Messier and, Thurman Munson, why is among others, why is Willis considered to be the captain? And you constantly hear him referred to. And I think, for two reasons. One, it was the way he carried himself, the kinds of leadership that he showed. Probably, probably I would say, in that extreme way, the Game 7, coming out stiff-legged and limping around for however many minutes he played in that game to inspire the Knicks to win the seventh game of the finals against the Lakers. So, that quiet, dignified leadership, and I think that also, the Knicks, more than any other team, I've said this many times, but more than any other team in New York over the last 50 years, the Knicks were the ultimate unifying team. They won those two championships. They're the only championships the franchise has won. So, of course, Willis and those guys are held up to a much higher level. But in terms of the unifying element, when you think about, even by 1969-70, excuse me, we already had, in football, the Jets had already won a Super Bowl with Joe Namath. So the city was divided between, Jet fans and Giants fans. Baseball, the Mets were only, 8 or 9 years old, but they had won the World Series in '69. So the city was already divided between Yankees and Mets, American and National League fans. The Knicks of that era, yes, the Nets, the ABA Nets were playing out in Long Island, but they were really, it was an afterthought. They were barely on the radar, and didn't become, a force until Julius Erving was leading them to a couple of ABA championships in the years before the merger. So, and on top of that, Madison Square Garden, more than any other arena, is really right in the heart of Manhattan, of the city. And so you add all those things together, and I think, Willis Reed represents something to New York, even more so than Walt Frazier, because that iconic night, even though Frazier stole the show, I mean, he really won the game for them. But Willis coming out and playing and hitting the first two shots, it really was the kind of dramatic moment that, people have been talking about for a couple of generations now. He set the standard for what playing in pain really is. It's something that I think will live on for many many years.
All right, I'll be right back in with Harvey in just a moment. We got plenty more to get into about Willis Reed, including a really, really fun and touching story at the end that Harvey tells, as well as a bunch of other stories in between. It just such a wellspring of knowledge Harvey was during this episode. So very excited for you to hear the rest. But I do just have to real quick award Nissan's Most Electric Player of the Week, brought to you by the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. And I don't know that he's gotten one of these yet, but I think that RJ Barrett is our Nissan Most Electric Player of the Week. He got his stuff together as far as scoring the basketball, even when his three-point shot is not falling lately. He's been getting to the hoop and really taking advantage of his physical gifts. He's been brilliantly fierce getting to the rim, and quite frankly electric, getting all the way in there and finishing through contact and also generating free throws. It's been pretty stunningly powerful when you watch RJ Barrett play. That's just kind of one of those things that you think of. He's stunningly powerful. For someone who's not necessarily the biggest guy on the court, he always gets where he wants to go and always has the power to do so. And he delivers on duality. Okay, maybe now I'm more talking about the Nissan Ariya at this point, with a combination of fierceness and elegance, beautiful but strong, the perfect SUV crossover. And the 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin you to your seat power and premium intelligence all in one EV. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. Yeah, I think the whole playing in pain thing really wound up being, or playing through pain, I guess would be the way to put it, really wound up being sort of a consistent theme throughout his career, because he had that moment in Game 7 and then goes through just tons of knee injuries leading up to the 73 win even, and yet still, even then, perseveres enough and puts together a great 73 season to win a second finals MVP. I think that his achievements, given what he was able to accomplish before his body sort of ultimately gave out on him, which, it was something that was more likely to happen back then. If you had a bulky knee or something, medical science wasn't where it is now. Like it would affect you more. I think that pound for pound, like, his career is one of the more impressive in NBA history as far as, championships won, accolades accumulated, and everything that he was able to accomplish in the relatively small amount of time that he was able to do it, before his body ultimately didn't let him do it anymore. I'll just, you wrote the obituary for Willis in the New York Times, which was beautiful. If anybody hasn't gotten to read that yet, but listed out his accomplishments: NBA's MVP in the 69 to 70 season, and the MVP of the finals that year, as well as All-Star MVP. And then he also was a Rookie of the Year as a quote-unquote second-round pick. I mean, it's different standards. I was listening back to our pod that we did with you back in 2020 when we were reminiscing on these teams, and that's always a funny note to me that he was a quote second-round pick, but was like the 8th pick overall, or 7th pick overall.
There were only a handful of teams.
Yeah.
And by the way, it infuriated him that he was picked in the quote second round, even though it was the 8th or 9th pick, whatever. And the Knicks picked a guy named Jim Bad News Barnes ahead of him, and he vowed that, he would win Rookie of the Year, and, he went out and he was the kind of guy who, he loved challenges. He loved the idea that, he was a bit of an underdog because he first of all, he played at Grambling, so he was not coming out of one of the big D1 basketball powers. Many black players in that era did play at the historically black colleges. But he loved these challenges and, improving people wrong. And one of the things about Willis, he's undersized center for that era, playing against Wilt and Nate Thurmond and all those guys. And Bill Russell was also on the other side aside. But I always said that if you look at Willis's game, it really, in my opinion, translates well to the modern game. I mean, he had a really nice, soft touch from about 17, 18 feet. So if you project, what the game has become with the three-point line, the guy was strong as an ox. There's no doubt in my mind that if he had gone out and practiced, jump shots from 23 feet, that he wouldn't have become a proficient shooter. He was lefty. He was mobile. He could put the ball on the floor. It was always a problem for a guy like Wilt Chamberlain to come out and guard Willis Reed. So when you look at his game, he handled the ball well. He passed the ball well. I think he would have done very well in the modern game, which is a great tribute to anyone who played that long ago and knowing how the game has evolved through the decades. Willis Reed could have played in any era. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah, I've always thought in a kind of funny way to reference him to another more contemporary Nick, like the mid-range shooting was almost Amari Stoudemire-esque. Just that elbow jumper that was just automatic, and that was, if I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, that was sort of the part of Willis's game that struck fear in Wilt Chamberlain, was the fact that he could shoot out into the mid-range, and that Wilt would then have to come out, and that just completely disrupted his flow of being like the guy at the rim, protecting the rim. All of a sudden he had this guy that he had to come out on and play against, and couldn't, like, it would draw him away from the hoop where he wanted to be. And that was exactly what Willis did in that game 7, was come out and just drill a couple of jumpers just to sort of send a statement. But on to your point, on the other end, he didn't give up anything either. And despite being a little undersized, especially for the time, as a center, he still was able to hold up against the biggest guys in the league, like Wilt Chamberlain, like that.
Well, he had tremendous upper body strength, and he understood positioning. Don't get me wrong. I mean, he used to tell me, for instance, the night of Game 7, Willis always said. I remember him telling me this when I was down in Louisiana, visiting with him for a few days. When I was reporting my book, and he said, everybody was going crazy when he walked out for Game 7, and he's thinking to himself as they're lining up, and he's looking across the way at Wilt Chamberlain like, this is a hell of a situation you got yourself into. They're expecting a miracle, and I'm going up against Wilt. But by the same token, I think that was a fascinating, by the way, that whole thing. The duel between Wilt and Willis was really interesting, psychologically, I think, because what you have to remember is that Wilt Chamberlain had suffered a knee injury that season and missed much of the regular season, and had made something of a heroic return for the last, 10, 15 games of the regular season heading into the playoffs. So he also, felt like, hey, I'm really putting myself out here. And then he gets into the finals, and then Willis gets hurt in Game 5, and now he's the wounded warrior. And now nobody's thinking about, Wilt, he had a bad knee too. Plus, Willis was another guy from Louisiana. Bill Russell was born in Louisiana and moved to the Bay Area of California when he was a boy. But he was another guy from Louisiana and left-handed, right? So now, like, Wilt, after suffering all those indignities, against Russell through the years when he was playing Philadelphia against the Celtics, now he's dealing with, like, another version, and although, Willis was a more polished offensive player than Bill Russell, especially when he was healthy, I think it played with Wilt's mind a little bit because, Willis got hurt in Game 5, and the Knicks, swarmed him with undersized guys. They had Nate Bowman, who was a center but foul prone, and then they had Dave Stallworth, and even DeBusschere, who was like barely was 6'6", and but they presented a problem for Wilt, on defense. So the Knicks managed to win that game, but then they go back to L.A. and Wilt destroys the Knicks without Willis, playing in that game. He had like 45 points or something like that, just dunking on people and just having his own way every time down the court. So now you're thinking, all right, Willis may play, but he's going to be a shell of himself. Wilt is going to dominate this game. And yet, I think there was that, that question like, why is this happening to me? I got to go up against this guy. I can't, I'm expected to dominate and win. And, sometimes when guys go into a game like that, it messes with their mind a little bit. And, legend has it that, and many people in my reporting for the book said that they saw Wilt, lurking, watching Willis warm up a little bit. Don May, who was a bench player on that Knicks team, was rebounding for Willis, much earlier before the fans were in the building, warming up, trying to, test his leg, and that they could see Wilt's head poking above the lower stand, checking out what Willis was up to. And George Kalinsky, the famous Garden photographer, told me that West had to come pull him away from the vicinity of the Knicks locker room because he was trying to find out whether Willis was going to play. And then this dramatic entrance. So all this stuff is going on. And, and the truth is that Willis really didn't have to do all that much because hit the first two shots and then, Clyde went from there. So, he was the MVP of the series. And I think even Willis would have admitted that it was a sentimental choice because Frazier really was the dominant player in that game.
All right, I'll be right back in with Harvey in just a moment to finish up talking about the legend, Willis Reed. And there's a really great story at the end of the episode that you're not going to want to miss. So I would encourage you to see it all the way through. But first, I just got to tell you guys that today's show is brought to you by Ibotta. We're always throwing money at something: kids' school supplies, a new house project. The list goes on. I know I got some house projects coming up. It's time to stop spending your hard-earned money without getting anything in return. Enter Ibotta. You can earn cash back on every shopping trip. Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop, and you can get your cash back. It really is that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 a year in real cash back. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, or you could use your cash back to buy that thing you've been eyeing, that game you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. Typical basket of groceries was over $50 more expensive at the end of 2022 than at the beginning of the year due to inflation. It's horrible. You can earn 2.5 times that in cash back from Ibotta, or even more, depending on how much you use Ibotta. And you can earn cash back at hundreds of online brands and retailers too when you start with Ibotta, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. So right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just to try Ibotta out by using code LOCKED when you register. So just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app and use code LOCKED. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store and use code LOCKED. Yeah, that's I think Clyde has made mention of that once or twice as well, about how well he played in that game and things of that nature, although Clyde is also humble to a fault as well, usually. But
he's always said, and I watched, for the book, I watched a video of Game 7, or at least the first half, because let's face it, the game was over. It was like 69-43 or something at the half, and Frazier just torched everybody. And he said to me, yes, when Willis got the car, he said, look, I had this incredible game, and 36 and 19 or 18, I can't remember how many he says. And he said, I was trying to establish myself as a guard on the level of Jerry West, who he dominated, and Oscar and those guys, right? And here I have this fantastic Game 7, to deliver the first championship to New York. And, my teammate who hit 2 shots and didn't play beyond the first few minutes of Game 5 either gets the MVP. He said I was pissed off. But he also said, that over the years, and, after we watched the first half, he said, I can safely say that that the one thing I discounted as a young man and as a headstrong, kid trying to prove himself to be among the greats, that how much inspired I was by Willis.
Mhm.
And that if he didn't do what he did, then maybe I don't get all juiced up and, do what I did. So he said, in that sense, as the emotional leader of the team, Willis did deserve the MVP.
Yeah, I think that it's always going to be one of those things that Clyde like would always say with his rational brain, yeah, I probably should have won it, but with his heart, like what everybody voted with, like yeah, Willis probably should have won it because he ultimately was the one who sort of sparked everybody along in that game. I wanted to pivot a little bit. So I know that, yeah, and you mentioned this before, and I mentioned it already. I'll plug it again. If people that are listening to this haven't read When the Garden Was Eaten yet, definitely should. I found it to be such a fantastic read, honestly. As someone who grew up in the 90s and didn't really get into the team until the 99 finals run, like that was my Knicks welcome as a fan moment was that. So I didn't even get to experience like the 90s really that much. I found it to just be a fascinating read of giving a look into like what those teams were, what they meant, what every player contributed. And I know that there were so many stories like that we talked about the last time that we had you on a few years ago, with regard to the book, like the story of Willis breaking up sort of a fight where Cassie Russell had come in kind of heated because he had been pulled over by some white police officers and racially profiled, and then kind of brought that into practice with him, and Willis diffused that situation. I remember you saying that a throwaway couple paragraphs in Dave DeBuscher's one book about that was sort of the impetus for you to write When the Garden Was Eaten. And there was so many other great stories in there as well about Willis and just his various exploits, the fight against the Lakers in like I think it was his second year in the league when he took on like 3 Lakers 3-on-1 and won the fight, and went up to his teammates afterwards and was like, why didn't you guys help me? And Dick Barnett was like, well, you were winning, so we left you. And
yeah, I think
all this,
the quote was, I think they cleaned it up in the book, but he sort of said, Willis complained in the locker room, where were you guys? Because remember, Daryl Imhoff had grabbed Willis from behind. That's a really dangerous situation. He really could have gotten cold-cocked by Rudy LaRusso with somebody holding on to him. Of course, he shook him off, and then all hell broke loose. And in his teammates' defense, the fight kind of spilled into the Lakers bench. So the Knicks were on the other side of the court. Not that they, couldn't have come over, as quickly as the thing broke out. But it's true, he was just basically beating the hell out of everybody. And when he said, where were you guys? And Barnett said, man, you was winning. So, it's, when the guys, it's funny because fighting has become, especially after the Malice at the Palace, it became such a, a blemish on the sport. And it's different today because of, the 24-hour sports media cycle, all the opportunities for people, whether it's, on cable TV or their phones or streaming, to see these things. And even the Malice at the Palace broke like right before the 11 o'clock Sports Center. It was almost like, made for primetime Sports Center. Back in those days, there was hardly any video of those games. And these guys, when they talk about it, I remember talking with Paul Silas, another wonderful guy who recently passed away. They talked about those fights like badges of honor. Like that's how the game was played. And, Willis fit that mold to the T. Just that the off-court Willis was a gentle man, gentle giant. And, but on court, man, he was fierce and he did have a temper. So, But I was listening to someone on the radio the other day, and they were saying that the whole thing with the Lakers was kind of like the Knicks hadn't been a very good team for many years. I mean, the early '50s. They made the NBA Finals, I think 2 or 3 years in a row. Never won, but into the '60s they weren't very good. And that night at the Garden, Willis kind of made a statement that we're not getting pushed around anymore. Those days are over. This is the start of something good. And it took them another couple of years for them to become contenders, but it really did kind of signal something. Something was up with that team, and and that was all about Willis.
So you alluded to it a second ago. Obviously that was the on-court Willis. That was the ultra competitive, willing to throw it all on the line for his teammates and his team and everything Willis. But I thought you summed it up really nicely in just one paragraph that I pulled from your eulogy of Willis, that I'll just read real quick. Off the court, Reed was a much gentler giant, and this is literally a paragraph right after you detailed the fight with the Lakers, so it kind of fits perfectly. But off the court, Reed was a much gentler giant, flashing an easy smile and typically extending a large hand to greet friends and acquaintances. Within the Knicks organization, he was known to be generous with teammates in an era where financial rewards in professional sports were not as substantial as they are today. That's something that I feel like always comes up. That last part about how generous he was with his time, with his money, with everything, that always comes up when Clyde talks about him, and something that clearly made a huge mark on Clyde growing up in the city as a basketball player. As far as like Willis always made it a point, it seems like, to extend a hand to the rookies, to make sure that they knew what it meant to be a Knick and play basketball for the Knicks. And that's something that the Knicks struggled to find for so long. And I think now we're finally starting to find again in terms of having culture setters, and that's like the big buzzword, and has been the buzzword for the last probably like 10 years in the NBA, is like, well, how's the culture? Like, how's the team culture? Like, can you just seamlessly integrate guys into what you have and, turn the whole team into a winner? And it seems like Willis was sort of like the epitome of that with what he did off the court and how well he treated his teammates, like picking Clyde up from the airport when he first flew in as a draft pick and showing him around the city and, taking him to Times Square and all this other stuff, and always rooming with the rookies and all that. I mean, in your reporting for when the Garden was eaten, and just in your time knowing and talking to Willis, like what were some of your takeaways from him just as a man, and just how he was as a person, like off the basketball court?
Well, he was not an ego-driven guy, very proud guy, but he didn't have an ego. He didn't need to be told how wonderful he was. He really, I think he had a real sense of, how good a player he was, and he wanted to be treated fairly and paid, what he was worth and all that stuff. But there's something about him, and I don't know if this is just something innate, the way he was raised, but there was something about him. He just, you often hear about people, they'll say he gets it, right? And that's the way I always felt about Willis. He just gets it. We're talking before about helping teammates. There was a kid on that team who did room with Willis, because Willis would take the rookies under his wing to kind of help them navigate, the transition from the college game to the pro game. But there was a kid on that 69-70 team from St. John named John Warren. And he's a Long Island kid, I believe. And I'll tell you a story about how what Warren told me, that during that season, he had a fiance. He was supposed to get married to this young woman, and something happened where she got really upset with him, and wasn't answering the phone, and he was a little distraught because I don't know what he did or, didn't do. I mean, who knows? But he told me that he was clearly, just dragging through, a week or so. And finally, Willis had enough. And he said, tomorrow, you and me are going out to her house in Long Island. And they drove out to Long Island, and they knocked on the door. And Willis said, I'm Willis Reed. Can we come in? We're going to settle this, right? He played mediator in the relationship between Warren and his fiancée. I mean, these are the kind of things that Willis would do. He would loan people money because, again, these guys weren't making, especially if you're only a marginal player, these guys weren't making a lot of money. He would get dates for people. I think it was Walt who said when he joined the team, Willis took him out and got him a date in New York.
He mentioned that on the broadcast, actually. Yeah.
So, it was things like that, and that made him, the captain. And it's no coincidence that he was named captain of the team not long after he tore apart the Lakers, because they saw that, he was a natural leader. And, that goes back to the whole thing with Cazzie Russell in Detroit, where, when we did the film, it's a lot harder to incorporate all the little details from the book into the movie. So one thing that was kind of left out was sort of the end result of that whole episode where, Cazzie gets, racially profiled coming out of Ann Arbor where he'd gone to college. The Knicks were holed up in Detroit for 2 or 3 days and they're practicing. And so he drives to Detroit and he shows up and he starts elbowing the white guys, Bradley and Don May and Mike Reardon and so on. And now Red Holzman was he had a mature team and he liked to let them police themselves if possible. And usually through Willis. So he just stood there and watched this, go on. And finally Willis stopped practice and said, Cazzie, what the hell are you doing? And before Cazzie could, stop himself, he said, be quiet, Uncle Tom. And now imagine that. Willis Reed grew up in the Jim Crow South. I mean, I've been to the town with him where he grew up, Bernice, Louisiana. It was an old mill town. It had 2 stoplights. But, he showed me the stores where he'd have to go in the back if he wanted ice cream because he was black. And he introduced me to, the man that his mother worked for as a domestic. This was a guy who understood what segregation was and what those laws were. But at the same time, he looked at the world in a positive way. He didn't bring all that bitterness into what he did. And so in that moment, when he might have torn Cazzie apart, Cazzie probably realized after he said what he said was like, uh-oh, I just signed my death sentence. Because Cazzie was a rookie playing his second game at the Garden the night that Willis tore apart the Lakers bench. So he saw Willis at his most furious, right? Mm-hmm. So in that moment, Willis is, I'm not saying he was consciously thinking, but something that he had, some quality, held him back. And instead of punching Cazzie in the face, he said, something to the extent of, you better start playing the right way or this Uncle Tom is going to be whooping some ass. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, he said, he gave him the out. You better start playing the right way right? But he gave him the opportunity to gather himself and step back. And Cazzie later apologized, got back to playing the game, back to scrimmaging. But bottom line is, I think Willis understood that Cazzie Russell, even though he had lost his starting position to Bradley by then, that Cazzie was an essential member of that team. He was their instant offense off the bench. And sure enough, in Game 7 of the first round against the Baltimore Bullets, the Knicks had destroyed in the playoffs the previous year, but in 1970, the Bullets put up a big fight. They were maturing as a team with Earl Monroe and Gus Johnson and Jack Marin and Wes Unseld. and they put up a hell of a struggle. And in Game 7, Bill Bradley was foul-plagued. I think he shot like 2 for 9. And as the Bullets struggled to stay within striking reach, they never really got blown out. Cassie came off the bench in the fourth quarter and hit like 4 really clutch baskets to help the Knicks stave them off. And, you know, if Willis had torn them apart, I think, you know, there's a possibility it tears that team apart because, you know, there was a lot of racial strife in this country during those days and in the middle of the civil rights era. And if Willis beat the hell out of him, he might have emasculated him and lost him.
Mm-hmm.
But by keeping him, you know, giving him a chance to kind of cool off and back down, he got back to business and he winds up, you know, you could argue saving their season.
Well, Harvey, this has been just a fantastic conversation once again, just like the last time I got to talk to you and talk about Willis and those teams. But as we start wrapping up here, I figured I would just give you the floor. Is there any final thoughts that you have on Willis or any like stories that you had from, I mean, you knew him and spoke to him at a lot of different times of his life, you know, as the coach of the Knicks, and then just throughout his long basketball career that was after his time with the Knicks and everything else. And then of course, researching your book. Like, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here on Willis?
Yeah, I would like to leave your listeners with this last story.
Mm-hmm.
It was from when I was reporting When the Garden Was Eden, and which was a privilege to do. These were, you know, spending quality time with the guys who were the icons of my youth. And so I went down to Louisiana, and Willis had built a house. He actually built a whole property with man-made ponds so he could fish. And his best friend, who had been his high school teammate, a guy named Howard Brown, he let him build a small house on the property, 3 Ponds Road. That was the name of that was the address. It's in Ruston, Louisiana. And so I'm sitting in Willis's great room in front of a huge screen, big screen TV, and I had put in my bag before I left a bunch of CDs. When I was started researching the book, I wanted to watch some of these old games again, or if a couple of cases the first time. And it's really hard to get really old NBA video. Just aren't a lot of, they just didn't do a lot or save a lot. But the Knicks helped me get videos of like Game 7 of the finals, Game 7 of the Boston series in '73 when they went up to Boston and won Game 7 at the Boston Garden. But also, and this was a very grainy, old, like a Scouts video. It jumped around a little bit. Game 5 of the '70 finals, which is the game Willis got hurt. So we're sitting in his great room, and I say to him, Willis, you know, I was hoping to watch a game with him. And he says, so which games do you have? And I said, you know, I tell him, and then I mentioned Game 5. And he goes, his eyes light up, and he goes, you have Game 5? And I said, yeah, it's right in my bag. And he goes, I've never seen that game. And I said, you kidding? And he said, no, I was in the back of the locker room. I was listening to Marv's broadcast on the radio while they were tending to my leg. I was in excruciating pain. So I said, let's watch it. So we're watching it, and, you know, he describes, he's looking at, you have the video of him, you know, trying to dribble around Wilt and goes down on the floor writhing in pain. And he said he had a bad, you know, his one knee was bad, and he thought he was probably protecting it. So, you know, the other leg, he pulled that muscle. In any event, we watched the video, and he dials up Bill Bradley, and he goes, Senator, I'm sitting here with Harvey, and we're watching great Game 5. What a great game. And he's talking like a fan, right? Because he's watching them win the game without him, right? Mm-hmm. And he's so thrilled that he's getting this opportunity after all these years to actually see some of those famous plays, like Dave Stallway driving around Wilt and scoring on like a reverse layup, which brought the Garden down. I'll just say this, there's like 100,000 people, in the New York area who claim to have been at Game 7. I claim to have been at Game 5. I was at Game 5. I had a friend whose uncle had 2 tickets and was traveling, and we got to go. We were sitting in the nosebleed seats up in the Blues, but we were there. So anyway, I say to Willis, you want to keep the video? And he goes, no, I don't want to keep it, but forever, but it's your video. But do I'd like to show it to a couple of my friends and my wife. And I said, sure. So he said, I'll send it back to you. Sure enough, a couple of weeks later, an envelope comes in the mail, and I open it up, and there's a little note attached to the case of the DVD, and it says, thanks, Harv, for the video, our greatest victory. And I thought about that for a second. He considered that team's greatest victory to be one that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And that is the measure of the man. And that's what I would like to leave your listeners with. That's who Willis Reed was. The ultimate team guy.
Well, that's a really lovely story and a lovely tribute to the guy. And I really appreciate that story. I love that. And I'm sure that everybody else will that's listening too. So with that, I think I wouldn't possibly want to sully that as the final note that we end on. So I'll say thank you for coming on, Harvey, so much to help me honor Willis Reed here. And, the captain, the forever captain of the Knicks, who clearly made a lot of impacts throughout multiple generations of Knicks. But Harvey, before I let you go, do you have anything that you want to turn people onto that you're working on, or direct them to any of your work that you've put out recently before I send you off?
I'm not working on any major projects right now. I would just say if you are interested in